We're in.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon to the folks attending wherever you're at. Definitely appreciate your attendance. Looks like we've got a great group here, and appreciate the feedback on the poll, so we've got a good understanding of our audience. So today we're going to talk about Azure Purview, and we're going to talk through implementation, capabilities, and some customizations. Steve and I have gone through Purview a couple of times now, so we've got some experience under our belt. We'd like to share that with everyone. So here's what we're going to go through today. We're going to go through some introductions so you can understand who Steve and I are. We'll do an introduction on Purview. We'll talk a little bit about data catalog basics. We'll talk about installation security. Then we'll put the slides behind and we'll actually get into the tool and do a demo, a walkthrough, a bunch of screens, show an actual scan and some results. And then finally, we'll talk through some lessons learned and some best practices. So who are we? So my name is Darren Zwanitzer. I'm a lead data architect for 3Cloud. So I've got about 25 years of experience in IT. Most of that is in custom app dev and business intelligence. But most recently, I've been supporting data migrations to Azure. I've driven some data governance initiatives, and I've implemented some data catalogs. So Steve?
Cool, it's nice to meet everybody. I've been in the IT sector for about 10 years. Prior to that, across a lot of different industries. My main emphasis is Power BI, and then crossing into a lot of Azure resources like Data Factory, Data Lake, and more recently Purview. And really, with my time with 3Cloud and prior to that with Pragmatic Works, I've worked across a ton of industries. So I bring kind of a wealth of experience of a lot of what these industries are asking for. And I look forward to sharing that today.
Thank you, Steve. I do want to mention, feel free to ask questions. There's a questions section in the GoToWebinar capability. Steve and I will do our best to monitor those and answer those as they come up, or if we need to wait till the end, we certainly can, but feel free to ask questions as they come up. All right, so we'll transition into Azure Purview itself. So, at its core, Purview is a data catalog. And a data catalog is quite simply an organized and detailed inventory of data assets. So a simple Excel file could be a data catalog as well. But extending the capabilities really helps to drive adoption and usefulness of a data catalog. And so we'll start to see some of those capabilities come through in Purview. So what does a data catalog do? Right? It helps within the organization to drive data literacy. And that means ensuring that your users understand what a piece of data is, where it exists, and potentially how do I get access to it. That's very much aligned as well to a data culture, the idea that data exists as an asset. It's not just something that's in an app somewhere, but it is a valuable asset and should be treated no differently than maybe a physical asset, be it a building, a piece of equipment on a production line, or something like that, right, in terms of an asset. And lastly, it's usually a foundational tool for both data management and data governance. From a data management perspective, that inventory of data assets is important to understand where is your data at. Having a searchable catalog can really help with efficiency. On the data governance side, being able to align policies, standards, risk, and stewardship to your data assets is very important, and a data catalog generally will support that as well. So business value that you get from a data catalog is really aligned to increasing efficiency and reducing risk. So the concept of self-service is typically where you're increasing efficiency. That ability to provide very broad access to many users to what typically is tribal knowledge and often is locked up within a data architect's mind, pull that out, put it into a data catalog, and make it then self-service, where power users, business users, and even IT folks can come into your data catalog, search, and then understand that information that's in the catalog. Additionally, being able to relate assets together, one to another, can be very powerful as well. You can begin to explore the information that you have, the assets you have, what those mean, and how your data is related, and that can yield new insights. On the reducing risk side, the relationships are important there as well, aligning policies to actual data assets. So think in terms of data retention. Think also in terms of sensitivity. Is something a highly sensitive piece of data, or is it a public use? So trust is important. The ability for stewards to come in and curate data, ensuring that what is in the data catalog is accurate and up to date, generates trust. The ability to endorse content within the catalog helps to signify that trustworthiness of your data. So the data catalog will become a primary source of truth and be the area where people come both to update information as well as glean new insights out of what you currently have. At the bottom, I've highlighted some of the pillars of a data catalog. The 4 that are in dark blue are supported within Azure Purview. Collaboration and data sets really aren't so much in Purview, but I imagine that's on the roadmap. So we'll talk first about the metadata side. That's really the core of a data catalog. So on the business side, you've typically got a glossary, terms and definitions. That's usually where your endorsements are at. Do you trust a piece of information? Have you validated that a calculation or definition is accurate and correct? You also have technical metadata. So that's your data sources. It might be databases, it might be files in a data lake. We can set up automated scanning to collect that technical metadata. That's where we would do classification or support lineage as well. Collaboration is a concept where you can just talk through, hey, is this definition right? I think it might mean this within my context. So again, out of the scope for the moment for Purview, but it can be an important component of a data catalog tool. And obviously, Microsoft has other collaboration tools like Teams, where you can perform those types of tasks as well. From a governance side, Purview has the ability to align assets and glossary terms to stewards, owners, or experts. So you can identify who is the right person to go to if I have questions. We can also implement policies and or standards within the environment and relate those back to technical data assets. Transparency is key in governance, so the ability for users to come into the data catalog tool to see what's in there, to understand the relationships and the content, that's important for governance. The datasets pillar is often about a tool providing the ability to create analytical datasets and providing access to them. So think of that as more of a self-service environment to get access to data. Again, outside of the scope of Purview at the moment. And lastly, the administrative pillar is where you can set security. Who can access what can they do? Where you can see metrics around your data catalog. How well populated is it? Where are we at in terms of our curation progress? And then of course, where we set our connections to our technical data sources. So that's a brief intro to Purview. If we take a step back and think data catalogs in general, what's one of their main goals? I'm representing here a data life cycle. We start by capturing data, then it usually gets stored and persisted somewhere in a maintenance mode. At some point, we might synthesize that data, might enrich it or perform calculations based on it. And then finally, we get more into a usage phase. We might be putting this data on reports. We might be sending it out to third parties as part of integrations. But eventually, we're done with that data, we'll archive it, and finally, we'll purge it. Typically, we'll find data issues in the usage area. If you think about from a development standpoint, we often talk about shifting left in the life cycle to reduce cost. The earlier we find issues, the cheaper it is, or the more cost-effective it is to address and resolve those issues. So here we're counterclockwise shifting, but the idea of a data catalog is to really try to identify issues earlier on in the life cycle. We want to move that detection and fix into the maintenance phase, potentially even into the capture phase. So that's one area we drive value as well, by capturing issues early. So we'll jump a little bit deeper into Purview. You can see on the right a screenshot of the main screen. It's a very Bing-like interface where your main thing is a search, but you've also got some jump points to get into additional capabilities. Purview is based on the open source Apache Atlas. So we have access to the APIs, and you can look through all the documentation on Apache Atlas to get a better understanding of how the architecture works under the covers. The market position for Purview is pretty important. It's a cost-effective tool. Other data catalog tools out in the market often start in the six-figure range and certainly can go up to almost $500,000 annually. A lot of it's dependent on the capabilities and the users that you have, but Azure Purview is a very cost-effective tool. For the moment, it's mostly a technical-driven tool. It's very focused on scanning our technical assets, but it does have some components that better align to governance. It's a great tool if you are in a growth stage, and so you can grow together with Purview. Microsoft has put forth a lot of investment into Purview, and the velocity of changes that are coming out is pretty significant. And so the idea is, if you are starting your data governance journey or your data catalog journey, Purview will help you along that journey and grow with you. Right now, most of the connectivity is focused on the Microsoft environment. Some recent changes have certainly expanded that, and Microsoft will continue to expand the data sources that they're able to connect with. But if you're currently focused mostly Microsoft, and it's great alignment for you with Purview. Something to keep in mind, Purview is in preview mode, and that looks like it's through end of May at this point. So keep in mind there's frequent changes. Sometimes there's some downtime, so there's no SLA. There was a time where we got in to do something and couldn't even get in at all. But that's really pretty limited. It is a pretty stable platform at this point. There are some limitations. They're still working through some things with connectivity here and there, but again, very active roadmap for changes. And the great thing is that there are some pricing discounts that are significant during the preview phase. So highlight a couple of key things with Purview. So right now there are 16 different data sources that you can connect to. Again, mostly Microsoft based, but you can connect to Oracle, Amazon AWS S3. There's a couple other non-Microsoft capabilities. And there are 105 system classifications that are built in. So beyond the built-ins, there's a lot of customizability within the tool. We can create different glossary templates. We can create custom classifications, scan rule sets, and we can use the API. And we'll dig deeper into that later in the webinar. Some items that are on the roadmap, of course, additional data sources that you can scan. Some workflow capabilities so that we can automate different actions within the tool. Some data movement insights. So if you're using Azure Data Factory, we should begin to be able to see how much data are we moving. Right now, the tool can certainly support Lineage, but not so much the metrics around what is moving. And finally, business rules. So you can set up some conditions and take actions. And so that might help you apply some additional customizations within the environment. All right, so that's the basics of Azure Purview. And with that, I will turn it over to Steve.
Cool, thank you. So you're at the point in your organization where you've decided to install Purview, and through our experiences, we've run into a couple prerequisites that we wanted to share. And these are things that you should consider before the actual installation, before you click the button to install Purview. And a lot of this has to do with how locked down your Azure environment is and what kind of access or role that you have in that environment. And so some of the prerequisites to walk through, and some of these might apply to you, some of these might not apply to you, depending on how elevated your role is within that environment. But first and foremost, you have to have Azure Active Directory tenant. It's kind of a mainstay, I would imagine most of you do. To a point, to even get Purview eligible, you have to be able to register a required resource provider. And so that's something that you might be able to do yourself if you're an owner in your subscription. If you're not an owner, this is something that you would have to ask someone else to do on your behalf. And these steps are really kind of spelled out in the Microsoft documentation around the installation of Purview. The next is you have to actually be permissioned to create the Purview account. And so when you go in to actually push the button, you have to either be an owner or contributor in that subscription management group or resource group again. So this may or may not be something that you can do. So you have to ask for those permissions to be granted. And then when we get to this point, we have to sort of like look at your Azure environment and say, is this very locked down, or are all of the resources able to communicate with each other pretty easily, or is this a very secure environment? And depending on your answer is going to depend on what additional resources you might want or require to be able to scan. And so we've introduced here a key vault, a virtual machine, and VNet integration. And this comes down to, you know, when Purview goes to connect to your other sources, sometimes we have to go through an intermediary to get that connection, and sometimes it can go directly to it. And we've run into these issues with our own deployments, and so we provide this to you as guidance. If you're going to, and if you think that you're going to need these tools, better to set them up or get them provisioned early than to have to keep going back and forth with your Azure owner as somebody who say, oh, by the way, we need this virtual machine. By the way, we need this. And on top of that all is you actually have to now assign the roles to Purview early in the process. And this comes down to the install. Like, let's say that you're able to install Purview. What happens then is you have a team of 5 people. If you haven't privileged those other individuals to access Purview, then you, the installer, will be the only one that can get in. And so something to think about early is, can we give those Purview specific roles out early to everyone that's going to need them, so that they can see Purview Studio, so that they can access that tool once it's been installed. And so save this slide. It's a good sort of overview of the steps you might want to consider doing before you even push the button. And so then once you've done these steps, we're going to kind of step forward to the next slide with what that installation looks like. It's very straightforward. The install is actually just clicking the button, deciding whether you want 4 capacity units or 16. Those are the only 2 options. You know, for a small space or small organization, 4 is more than adequate. And then an awareness of any existing Azure policy that might be in place. And this is spelled out again in the Microsoft Docs, is if you step through this installation and you have Azure policy preventing Purview from creating a storage account and an event hub, it's going to kick it back, and that validation will fail. And so if that's the case, if you run into that, you just have to create a custom policy with tags to kind of overwrite that. Now, also to note that Purview will automatically spin up a managed identity with the same name as the Purview that you've given it. So you'll have these tools available for you. If you are the installer, you automatically are provisioned a Purview Data Curator and Purview Data Source Administrator role, which for you, Purview Studio will show up. You'll be able to click into it. Kind of stepping back to that previous slide, if you haven't given other individuals on your team or in your organization access to Purview, you're the only one that can get in. No one else is going to see Purview Studio. No one else will have that option. So again, if you want others to be able to see and utilize Purview, make sure you're giving out those roles. We'll talk about those roles more specifically in the next slide. And then other considerations here, as now that you've installed Purview and you're looking at that resource, is for a lot of what you have to do to connect sources and scan, we have to sort of allow Purview to access these resources we talked about before. So some considerations to do is to actually take that Purview managed identity and add it to an access policy in that key vault you're going to use. Another thing is, if you plan to scan Power BI, you have to create a security group with that Purview managed identity, and then take that and put it into Power BI. And again, those are spelled out pretty specifically in the Microsoft Docs. Something to consider just doing right after the installation, especially if you yourself don't have access to do this in Azure. It's very easy to make a full list of what you want, send it to an individual, and allow them to put these things all in one swing, rather than having to keep going back and forth. Oh, by the way, we need this. By the way, we need this. The other pieces you'll need, if you have to connect to on-prem resources, we'll need to go through an integration runtime. So we've done this through simulated with a virtual machine. If you have a server running on-premise, you can also install the integration runtime on site, but that's another piece of connectivity that you'll need to have in place, as well as the app registration if you plan to use a service principal, or if you intend to want to use the API. Again, just setting all this up early is going to save you time from having to go back and forth and say, oh, by the way, we want to use the API. we need an app registration. So just kind of think in your head, can I do this myself, or do I need somebody to do this for me? And if it's the latter answer and somebody's got to do it for you, best to make their life easier, make a list of everything you need at the beginning and say, hey, can you help us out with this? Some things have to take place before the installation, some things take place after. All right, so looking at the 3 security roles within Purview, they're spelled out fairly well, but most individuals who would consider themselves a Purview administrator are going to want 2 roles. So you're going to want a combination of the data source administrator role and the Purview data curator. The data source administrator is really what gives you the ability to set up the scans. The data curator is sort of a contributor role to Purview. So you have access to a lot of the elements within that program. You're able to update the metadata, update statuses. And we called out here with kind of like a black border that really only 2 roles actually have access to Purview Studio. So you need, even if you want to be a data source administrator, you technically won't have access to the studio. That's kind of why we bridged these 2 roles together with the red box, saying it's probably best to just consider that you have both of these roles. And then any individual within the business that just needs to see Purview or read the data within it, but doesn't need to make any edits, they just need read access to Purview Studio, they'll just need the Purview data reader role. And that's kind of how we separate whether you're using Purview for data discovery or whether you're a data steward looking to come into Purview to actually update and enrich the metadata. Okay, so from this point, what we're going to do is actually step forward and go into our Purview sandbox and show a couple of the steps that are taking place. So I'm going to hand this back over to Darren for the first steps there.
All right, thank you, Steve. Let me bring up Purview. So we have our own environment that we've set up, and we've installed Purview in that environment. It shows up just as an Azure resource. When you go to that resource overview tab, if you have appropriate security to get into Purview Studio, you'll have a link that shows up. Launching that link will open up Purview Studio. Let's come back to the main area. And you can certainly give this link to end users, so your business users, right? Folks don't need to have an Azure portal level of security other than the security roles related to Purview. So they don't need to see the resource itself as long as they're secured in a way that they can see Purview Studio. So the main screen, very similar to what I had posted in the slide deck. We've got a capability search, quick launch, a couple of items, and then a side menu. I'm going to start off jumping into the glossary, so focused on the business metadata pillar. We'll jump into the glossary. Typically, a glossary is thought of as just a list of terms and definitions, but Purview has a capability of creating term templates. So a template is a set of attributes that can be collected. So by creating custom templates, we can extend the default, and we'll see in a moment how we can make use of that. But first, we can see and search through this if we wanted to, a set of mostly term and definition, but you see some examples of policies that I've put in place. We'll come up here to Azure Powershell. So here's a default template term Azure Powershell with a definition. We can create acronyms. We can relate those to our technical catalog assets. In this case, there are no relationships. We can set up links to external resources. So here's a nice link out to how to actually install and configure Azure Powershell. We can take a look at related items. So here I said that PowerShell, which is a separate term, is a synonym of Azure PowerShell. We can also see that I've related Azure PowerShell to other Azure terms. So you can create relationships as well. Fairly recently released is this concept of parent-child. I've not set that up here, but you can create hierarchies within your glossary. We can also set up contacts for these business glossary elements. So here Steve is considered the data steward, and I'm considered an expert. So that's kind of the default template. That's a term definition type of glossary. But I've established a few others. So you can see we can filter to a single term template type at a time. So I've created a concept of a policy. And I did this so that we can start to relate our technical assets to these policies. So this is really the governance aspect of Purview. So I had mentioned the idea of retention policies. So we might have different retention periods that we could create. I also mentioned sensitivity. So we can set up sensitivity levels. And in this case, I've set up that parent-child relationship where we have a term that's sensitivity that might describe a high-level policy around sensitivity, and then a very specific internal use sensitivity term. I've created things in here like data domains. If you want to begin to organize your glossary terms into different data domains, you could create a report catalog in here as well. If we're unable to scan the technical metadata of a report catalog, you could certainly load that in here. Let's see, I've created the idea of an application catalog, that there might be some use in being able to relate which technical assets are related to applications, or even relating other glossary terms to applications. So the idea is that you can manage term templates. These are the attributes available in the default, but I created these two custom term templates, and we can add more, we can edit. Each attribute has the ability to be an open text, a single choice, or a multiple choice. We can add to these templates over time. We can expire fields so they're no longer available. It's fairly robust in terms of templating and attribute creation on glossary terms. So this is an area where you can get creative with storing business metadata, really anything that's useful to relate to technical metadata. All right, with that, Steve, I'm going to hold off on the classification and scan rule sets until after your next part. So I'm going to come here, and I'm going to give you keyboard and mouse, and yeah, I'll leave it to you if you want to get rid of that.
So we'll kind of talk a little bit about, so you've installed Purview, we've set up sort of some of these ideas of what you want to do, and within your organization, I think the first thing you would want to do in Purview beyond the glossary is to actually look at registering sources. And we've set up some sources here. We'll kind of just look at the basic experience. As Darren noted, a lot of what's available out of the box in Purview are Microsoft connected sources. So a majority of these sources here, and this list is still the same for the last 2 weeks, but it's growing. I'd say about once a month or so, a new source or a couple new sources are added. So you have these out of the box. Now, if you want to add a source that's not available here, we will talk about some of the API tools and how we've uncovered some pathways to adding sources that are not available on this list. But for starters, we're just going to look at one of these. I'm just going to pick an Azure SQL database. One note about adding sources is that you have to have access to the source to begin with. So you can't just, by being privileged into Purview, suddenly access the entire subscription of your organization. You know, if I pick one of these, and let's just pick this one here, you know, I can only see in this what I have access to. So you're only going to be allowed to access the things that you yourself have access to. And then within that, you'll pick whichever server you want to add. It'll bring a drop-down list here of what the endpoint to that is, and you'll be able to select a collection and add it. We're not connecting to it yet. We're not scanning anything yet. We're just putting it into the screen as a collection. So we're just creating that underlying point of, hey, I have access to this source. I can put it into a collection. A collection here just represents a visual organization of the data. There are plans within the roadmap within this collection to provide additional functionality. But for all intents and purposes right now, we're just able to visually put them into sort of buckets. What we can do with those buckets are kind of limited at the moment. It's really at this point just a visual appeal with this idea that we might be able to provide permissions or scans against certain collections, but that isn't quite available yet. So once you've got your source added, the next step is to kind of look at it and say, you know, let's kick off a scan. And really a scan happens once the source has been added. So I'm going to pick this Azure SQL DB here. And we can just set up a new scan or look at previous scans using some of the buttons. I'm just going to kick off a new scan. And what I want to look at here is some of the options. So we basically are, if it's an Azure-based source, we're going to connect to it through an auto-resolving integration runtime, similar to Azure Data Factory would do. We're going to, again, pick the database from within that I want to connect to. Let's see if this one wants to bring down, again, and this is Darren's computer, and this particular data source is one that he does not have access to, but that I have access to. And you can see already that if somebody doesn't have access to something, it's, even though it's in Purview, it's not giving him permission to kick off a scan on something that he doesn't have access to. So we would have to look again at some of the other tools here and find something that his account is privileged to scan. And so those are some of the protections or security in place. We ran into quite a bit of this when working outside of our organization, within other organizations, where you have to start to ask, you know, how are we going to connect? And one of the big hiccups with connecting to another Azure resource is if the organization is locked down and it's not allowing any connection between Purview and, let's say, an Azure SQL database, as in its Purview instance, Purview isn't, or in its preview instance, Purview doesn't have a published IP range that we can privilege. So it's not a trusted Azure resource yet. So we're kind of in this moment where if we're not opening up the firewall to let anybody in, we have to sort of find these workarounds. And so again, let's just see, I should be able to pull down a database name. It would provide the name here. If that name would show up, we would then select the credential from our Key Vault. These are all credentials we've saved into Key Vault that's been connected to this Purview instance, and we connect through it. In this case, you can also test the connection. I think a lot of the hurdles that we uncovered early with this work were just around getting this connection to work. And it has to do with a lot of those prerequisites we talked about. And so one example I'll show here is in many cases on client machines, we found that we weren't able to connect Purview with an Azure SQL DB. And so one of the workarounds was to take an integration runtime, install it on a virtual machine within the same VNet as that Azure SQL DB, and kind of basically connect through it as if it was on-premise. And so this same connection flow would work for on-premise instances as well. So we have a SQL server. This is actually a simulated SQL server. From our list here, we have an integration runtime that's sitting on a virtual machine that's running. So one of the prerequisites we talked about. We then have to know the database name. So again, if you don't have this there, I'm gonna go ahead and see it. Let's see if I can type in. We have a database that we can connect to, and a credential, in this case, saved within our Key Vault in Purview. So we created this credential in Purview, which is pointing to our Key Vault. Again, whether the Key Vault is behind a firewall or not can also be another issue to consider. In our experiences, we had to turn off the firewall to enable to connect just to the Key Vault. And so that was another hurdle of saying, well, in this case, we're going to turn it off. You could use private endpoints as well. We should be able to test the connection. Green is good. So once we get a green connection, we can step forward with the scan. The scan will show you a list of tables. We can scope the scan in this step. Nearly all sources can be scoped. The one current exception to that is Power BI, which does return every asset within your organization's Power BI instance. And so although you can turn off the personal workspaces, Power BI is the only one that you can't individually select what you want to return. So we'll continue. If we had created a scan rule set, here is where we could pick it. We're just using the defaults, and we can select how often we want to scan. In this case, we're just gonna pick once. It's gonna give us a summary page, and at that point we can kick, and now we're basically scanning. Other thing worth noting here before I hand it back over to Darren to talk about enriching that metadata is we can also connect to our Lineage providers. Here, you have to have a certain level of access in Purview and with Data Factory to even see this option or to see this new button. So again, a lot of what happens in Purview comes down to what permissions do you have? What permissions do you have to the things you want to connect to? And here we can see that these two Azure Data Factories are running. Okay, let me hand it back over to Darren to talk a little bit about enriching the metadata that's returned from the scans we just kicked off.
Thank you, Steve. All right, let me turn off your mouse, hopefully. There, you should be free to be using your mouse. Okay, So we kicked off that scan. We're going to give it some time to complete, and then we can go back and take a look at it. But in the meantime, I wanted to show the technical assets that we have been able to look at. So certainly end users can come in and search. So search for customer. We can see there's a lot of customer information. These are all technical assets. Currently, the global search only searches those technical assets. It does not search the glossary. There's a separate glossary search within the glossary component, but I was told that Microsoft is working to integrate those two together. You can use the filters on the left side to further narrow your search. Maybe you're only concerned about customer information that came from Salesforce. And so you could say, only show me technical assets for which a relationship has been established to Salesforce, or has a specific SME or a particular classification. Right, so that's the search capability. You also have an ability to just come in and browse. So on the browse, we start really at the top level looking at our different data source types. We can drill in to a given data source type and see all of the databases, right, that we've registered to scan. And then we can continue to drill lower and lower. See the schema, and in this case, there's only one SQL table. If there were more in that schema, we'd see the rest. I'm going to go back to that customer, and we'll talk about, right, once we've scanned all this in, what's the value? Certainly your technical folks can come in and do a search and find it, but a lot of the value of a data catalog comes in enriching this metadata. A user could certainly come in and update some of the basic attributes. Let's give it a good description. What is it? We could potentially even classify the whole table, or you can see that schema elements have been automatically classified, and then it summarizes those up here. The automated scan has also identified this hierarchy, right? Server, database, schema, table. But this is where it gets interesting. I've manually related this particular table to these glossary terms. So at a glance, I can see that this table has a permanent retention policy associated with it. It should be considered confidential, and it came from the Salesforce application. So from a governance standpoint, right, you can align your technical assets to governance-related policies. You can also, from a more of a governance standpoint, associate to contacts. Right? These are no longer considered stewards because they're technical assets, but we've got owners. So these are often technical owners of this data. And we know Steve knows all about customers, so he's identified as an expert as well. We can see the schema on the table, the classifications that have been applied, and we could even drill in to the individual column. Let's come back out to, see, I don't think, yep, okay. So we'll come back out to the table. One thing we can do is edit this object. In preview, this is a key thing to keep in mind. Any manual changes you make to a technical asset will prevent future scans. They're working on this. I don't have a timeline for release, but this is pretty critical. In order to, or I should say, an impact of updating one of these technical assets is that a subsequent scan will not update it. So just use caution with that. So here we could apply custom classifications or built-ins, but things that were not automatically detected during the scan. Or we could associate individual columns with specific glossary terms. So here, if you've got definitions from a business perspective, and you've got a column that is the instance or instantiation of that term, then you'd want to create that relationship. And you can certainly do the same at the table level, right? This is the customer table. We can associate, or we can classify the overall table. And we already saw that this is related to 3 glossary terms, but we can relate it to anything else within the glossary. So that's really how you enrich your technical assets, find the technical asset, edit it, update it. There is an ability to update, bulk update or bulk edit and add glossary relationships. Let's come back out here. I think the sales aggregator had good lineage. Is that correct? I see Steve nodding. So from a lineage perspective, we're able to see, here I've clicked on a Power BI dashboard, and our scanning has identified that that dashboard uses these reports that came from this data set, right, that was populated by, I think this is a data, yeah, this data flow. We'd be able to go back to the source system as well. If ADF might have been involved, or if this is a SQL table, you'd be able to go back to source systems. So there's some limitations in what lineage providers can be used. We saw ADF. There's just a subset of the capabilities in ADF that can be used. But we can use the API to augment lineage as well and add to that. Before I jump into the API though, I want to do a quick classifications show. So this is the 100+ built-in classifications, a lot of international. Scroll down, there's some US. So these are built in. We can also create some custom classifications. Purview uses either regular expressions or a Bloom filter based on a known list of values. I think within the last week, they allowed custom classifications to support that Bloom filter concept where you can upload a set of values. So here we can see I used a regex to identify a GUID. Your classifications can be based on either the column name or the data content. So we'll actually scan the data and attempt to pattern match that data. There's some thresholds around number of unique values and a minimum threshold for a number of values that match a given pattern to be able to qualify it as a classification. So you saw a significant number of classifications, and of course it takes compute resources to compare your data to each of those classifications. And we are charged based on scan compute. So the idea of a scan rule set gives you the ability to reduce the classifications that are checked during a scan. So here we created a custom scan rule set that's going to be using the SQL DB type and will only check a subset of the classifications. So it's a cost savings measure to eliminate compute cycles on classifications that we know are not going to be used within our data. Okay. Actually, let's go take a look at our scan. That was this one, Steve?
Yep.
So 323 is today. So we had a successful scan. You can see we completed this. 24 assets were classified, 28 assets were discovered. It took 24 seconds. So we initiated that scan on this call and it has completed. We had already scanned this, so there aren't any new assets that were created, but it did discover, and then it would have updated any changes as long as we had not manually changed those same technical assets. Another component I want to show are insights. So this is a set of metrics that let you see what's in your data catalog. So we can see we've connected to 7 different source types. We've got over 1,000 assets, and we've classified 108 of those assets. We can see the breakdown of our different source types. If you've got a data lake, you can see some information on the file-based source types and different files not associated with a specific resource set. We can see a history of our scans. See, we had a couple of failures. We probably didn't turn off the firewall on the key vault. We can see some metrics around the glossary elements and a nice word map to see which glossary elements are most used. So it's based on how many assets, technical assets, are related to that glossary term. We can get a high-level sense of our curation progress. So terms that have assets, terms that do not, and the current status of a glossary asset. So that's an important thing I skipped. Our glossary terms can have a status associated with them. So as your stewards curate your glossary terms, You can change the status to approved. It could sit in draft while it's in progress, or there might be an issue with the term, so you could set it to alert. You can also assess the completeness of your terms. You can see a breakdown of your classifications that are in use. See it broken down by file or by table, and see that trend over time as you scan more sources. If you have M365 Compliance Center, there's a pretty easy connection point to Purview. So Purview can make use of the same sensitivity labels that are defined within Compliance Center. We just don't have that set up here in our environment. And lastly, if you've got a data lake and you scan it, you could see all of the different the different file extensions that are in use. It might be CSV files, text files, Parquet, etc. We used to have one here, but I imagine it's older than 30 days old at this point. We mentioned that we have used the API. What we had to do for one customer, they had reports within a Sisense environment, and Purview was unable to scan Sisense like it can Power BI. So we were able to use the API to create different components within the technical assets. So we created the concept of a data set separate from a report. Let's just jump to one of these. We even created some lineage that shows this report. There was a process that took from this data set to use the data from the data set in that report, and then it really came from this Azure SQL table. So all of this was built out using the API. All right, that concludes the in Purview demo. We're going to jump back to the PowerPoint slides, and I will turn it over to Steve.
Yeah, it's worth pointing out with regard to the API, if you're looking to add your own custom elements to your Purview instance, let's say you're using something that's not currently included, you do have to follow the Apache Atlas API structure. And so it's not as easy as just, oh, here's the name of my reports, let me just import this with a REST API. There's a whole architecture to the Apache Atlas API that you have to follow. So before you create an entity, you have to create an entity type definition, sort of a bucket to put that entity within. And so we kind of walk through this process. Same thing with connecting to things. And so what you saw on screen there was sort of an evolution of understanding how does this Apache Atlas API work? And then how do we create the correct buckets to hold the information and then associate it accordingly? There's a little bit of documentation. I'd say it's documentation light. Microsoft has yet to release their own REST API information. It's sort of coming out at a trickle. So we're happy to provide a little bit of insight around that, but we do want to demonstrate that we were able to do that successfully using Postman to kind of send those resources into our Purview instance. Some of the best practices and kind of takeaways from our early use with Purview is really just sort of stressing that the success of a tool like Purview is really going to be around user adoption. People have to see this as the place to go to find information about what data exists in their organization. And with that search tool, it makes it very easy, very fluid for anybody to go in as long as they have access to Purview Studio to search and say, hey, I need to pull an employees table into my data set. What's going to be the source I can use? And if I have a question, who's the person I can contact regarding that? Purview really brings that to the surface and provides an easy central hub for people to connect to with that. And in line with that, you have to have data stewards and data teams that are willing to do the work to keep that information up to date. Otherwise, it just becomes siloed, and then you end up just reaching out to the same people saying, hey, what am I supposed to do? What does this column mean? Oh, I'm not sure what the definition of this is. And above and beyond that, it's looking at a lot of the enrichments and customizations. Do we have social security number flying through undetected all the way into a Power BI report? You know, is there sensitive information that people don't know about that's somehow getting up into areas where you may not want it to? Purview is going to give you that visibility because of those classifications or custom classifications. You can find that information and sort of monitor and keep tabs on where it might be going. Other things to note about Purview is it is in preview, so there is a release cadence You can keep track of that through a couple channels, but within Purview itself, there's sort of a release notes and updates menu that will tell you what's been updated. We're seeing about every couple weeks another update has come out. This program was released in early December, and so it's steadily growing. The Microsoft Docs update in sync with those releases. So if you're on the Docs page, the information you see there is going to be in parallel with what is currently available in preview. They do a pretty good job of syncing those two resources up. As we've mentioned, depending on how locked down your Azure environment is, there are some security and network connectivity concerns, like how am I going to connect to, we had issues connecting just to the Key Vault because Purview wasn't a trusted resource, so we had to take the firewall down to come in. There's no published IP range for Purview yet. So in light of these things, we had to find these alternative pathways. Now, if you're watching this webinar 6 months later, that may not be the case. But as of right now, those are things to keep in mind as you start to take Purview from maybe a sandbox environment to more of a structured, secure, lockdown Azure environment. And as you run into those little hiccups or those test connection failed, it's worth setting up a diagnostic settings to send that information to Log Analytics that you could drill into that a little bit more. We found some of this stuff helpful, but really it was just sort of like, coming back and forth and saying, okay, well, let's try this and taking these alternative steps. And so through this sort of iterative process of understanding the security landscape and what's available in Purview, we were able to really set up a successful environment of Purview and hand that over to a couple organizations to say, let's grow this and see what your business users really want to get from this, and let that data governance team take it and run with it. So I know we've got just a few minutes left. I think if there's any questions here worth talking about, we will be happy to share. I'm looking here at the question box. It says, can you share Purview's data lineage utility that compares to, and then it's program name that got cut off in mine. But I'm not sure if Darren, you can see the whole question. Are there any other questions in there while we work to uncover? It says, do you need Data Factory to create lineage mapping? If you do need Data Factory to create Lineage Factory, if you're using Data Factory for Lineage. If you're just using Power BI, there's Lineage processes automatically pulled from Power BI that just get imported in there. And one thing worth noting, we did a lot of testing to see, can I take something from a source, let's say on-prem SQL Server, and pass it all the way up the chain to a Power BI dashboard, and can we see this lineage journey? And as of today within Purview, the Power BI lineage lives in the Power BI framework, and the Azure lineage lives in the Azure framework. The two kind of don't quite connect as well as you would hope, that you have this huge lineage journey, but there's only a handful of lineage providers. So even if you're using Data Factory, but you're using, let's say, some stored procedures, that might not be something that Data Factory picks up. So it is something worth considering that you don't need it, but there's only a handful of lineage providers available right now. And it says, can file scanning read the file's metadata if it exists, definitions, field headers, etc.?
I don't believe it can at this point. It's really basic metadata about files. We haven't dug too deep in that yet, but I know that it's at the least on the roadmap. But I know like JSON it can't do, but I'm not certain about basic text or CSV.
Okay.
So I did answer the Databricks question. So Databricks is planned as a connector in the second half of 2021. I can't unfortunately be any more specific than that. Snowflake, I've not seen on the roadmap yet. It can't currently scan Snowflake. In the process of answering the import-export content. So in terms of importing content into Purview, that has to be the API. Export, you can also use the API, but the glossary, you can export as a CSV. So all of the items in the glossary, but the technical metadata, that's all API only.
And the last one, do you have a Postman collection you can share with examples? Yeah, that's something I'll work with Darren and Crystal. We have some examples. I think what we were using was a lot of the Purview tech community does provide similar examples that you can put through. That's something, certainly maybe we can post on our 3Cloud site as well, just a base underlying set of code that you can use to push an entity in.
And it might be worth having a direct connection with that person, or we might be able to work directly with them. Brian asked if there's an SDK for working with Purview. So there's the API, but there's no client SDK. There is a Python library that exists to work with the API. We chose to use just Postman with standard post request, post put deletes. But yeah, there's no client SDK. Scanning work for XML file. I don't believe that it will. That's something that we can take a deeper look into. I assume that really means the content and the schema of the XML file. What do I do to get Purview working when my data sources are behind private endpoints? So that's where the integration runtime comes in. So Purview, right, is a PaaS resource. It runs, basically internet facing, so it can connect to other Azure data sources. But to get access inside of a network that's firewalled off, that's where you set up that integration runtime. So it can be sits on a VM inside the target network. Purview can connect directly to it, and then it can get access to any sources within that machine hosting the integration runtime. So as long as you had whatever network connectivity you needed from that VM hosting the runtime to that source, that's the way that you would get into any other private type of data source. These are great questions. So yes, can we profile data stored in Azure Synapse? So you can connect and scan Azure Synapse workspaces. You use the term profile. Just want to be clear that there's no real data profiling. So we're not looking at statistics on the data captured, but it will capture the technical metadata. Do you like this tool? How does it compare to Octopi? So I don't know Octopi. Steve, do you know Octopi?
Nope.
So do I like the tool? It definitely works well for a specific use case, right? Without the collaboration pieces, it's fairly limited from a governance perspective, but it's really great from a technical data catalog side, right? Low cost. Other tools are a lot higher cost. So if cost is a concern, this is well positioned for that. All right, if it scans the the data sources that you want it to scan, it's worth it, right? It's all consumption-based cost. You can stand it up, try it out pretty quickly, and see if it meets your needs. So it's very much, does it align to your particular situation? Again, going back to what we had in the earlier slides, if you're looking for a cost-effective tool, it's a little more technically focused rather than data governance focused without those strong collaboration pieces. But you can certainly do collaboration in other tools. So if you're aligned to that, have mostly Azure sources, then it's a pretty great tool. It's certainly for the cost as well. I'm not certain about SQL extended properties. That's something we can look at. Master data services. I don't believe that there's any integration with master data services at this point. I don't know if that's on the roadmap. So we can also confirm that.
That looks like the last question. So with that, we definitely want to thank everybody for your time and attention. If you have additional questions or want to get into contact with us directly around a Purview implementation, by all means, please reach out. We'd be happy to kind of entertain that discussion, especially around the API or any custom utilization that you have any issues or questions about.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. We really appreciate it. At this point, we can turn it back over to Crystal to close us out.
All right, Darren, Steve, thank you so much for hosting the webinar. We greatly appreciate it. I know there's a few people in the chat asking about the recording. The recording will be sent in your email box tomorrow around noon Eastern Standard Time. You can also visit it on our YouTube channel at 3Cloud under our free training playlist. All that information will be in there. I will get any links or anything else that you guys are requesting and place it in the email tomorrow too as well. I'll get that stuff from Darren and Steve. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or Darren or Steve. We're so happy to have you guys in here. I hope you guys have a good rest of your Tuesday. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.